Coming up, the betting markets give Alabama some good news, Florida gives its own fans some good news, and the transfer portal gives LSU some good news. It's all on the way next here on SEC Country Live. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us here for SEC Country Live. My name is Brandon Adams. Busy show, as always, every Wednesday, 3 p.m. For those of you who've made an appointment to tune in for us on the YouTube page there at 3 p.m., that's SEC Country Live on YouTube or SEC Country on Facebook. Thank you so much for being a part of what we're doing. Thank you for telling other people out there that we are doing this each and every week. It's been fun to be back in the saddle again for SEC Country Live, and I really appreciate all of you for having been a part of it. We've got a busy show, as I said. A few minutes from right now, a little less than about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes or so. We're going to talk to Chip Patterson from CBSSports.com. Chip, great guy covering college football, the SEC. We'll get his thoughts on the league for the upcoming season. We'll do that around 15 minutes after the hour here on today's program. Before that, though, I want to go above the fold with the big news around the SEC, and that is that some of the early look-ahead point spreads for upcoming games here for this upcoming season are starting to leak out, trickle in. And boy, you hear me every time we bring a guest on this show, some version of the same question gets asked in every one of those instances. Hey, can anybody in the SEC West challenge Alabama? Is there a legitimate threat to Bama on its schedule, or are we going to be forced to endure what has become, and I say that for those who are not Alabama fans, but are we going to be forced to endure what is to some kind of boring, to some kind of the thing we've all seen before? Is it another year of chalk for Alabama, or is there the possibility that someone could step up and play the role of spoiler and prevent Alabama from going back to the SEC championship game, back to the college football playoff? Some version of that question gets asked every time we do this show, because that's the hope of a lot of non-Alabama fans, and it's also, to those who are a little bit more neutral observers, it just kind of makes the thing more interesting. Well, if you're hoping for someone else to challenge Alabama, you may remember on last week's show, we started by talking about the war of words that's out there that's mostly been generated by Texas A&M coach Jimbo Fisher, but Nick Saban, the Alabama coach, had kind of a funny retort to all of that when he was asked about the fact that Fisher said he was going to beat Saban's, he used a different word, but I'll use the word behind, while Saban is still the head coach at Alabama. Saban had kind of a funny response to all that last week. Well, the fact of the matter is that the betting markets don't quite see it that way for the upcoming season. Not for Texas A&M, not really for anybody else that's currently on Alabama's regular season schedule. Let me give you a little bit of evidence that supports this from Brad Powers, guy that covers the college football world from the betting landscape. These numbers come via FanDuel Sportsbook. We'll look at a few of these for the rest of the SEC in a moment. Let me look at just Alabama for right now, if you want to kind of get an idea for what the betting experts are saying with the Crimson Tide for the upcoming season. We saw a relatively close SEC championship game a year ago between Florida and Alabama, but according to FanDuel Sportsbook, early look ahead, Bama going to Florida in the Swamp here this season. Bama a 15-point favorite in that game, so not expecting as close a game this time, even though Florida has the home field advantage there. Also, if you're interested in this, Bama going to Texas A&M, as we said before. That's the game that Jimbo Fisher has kind of caused the SEC world to circle based on some of the stuff that he said, but the folks there in, sportsbook world not expecting that game to be very close. They've got Bama as a 13-point favorite at Texas A&M right there, not expecting much of a challenge. Let me see some of these other numbers for Brad Powers. We'll come back and look at the rest of the SEC here in a moment. Also, against LSU, Bama right now, early look-ahead line, 24-point favorite against the Fighting Tigers of LSU. That's a game we've come to expect to be close. In 2019, we saw LSU step up and get the win there. But at least the gambling public does not expect that to happen again here. And then if you go to the final game of the regular season, as you see there from Brad Powers on Twitter from FanDuel Sportsbook, Iron Bowl, Auburn has won the last two Iron Bowl meetings there at Jordan-Hare Stadium in 2017, 2019. But as that game shifts back to the Plains again here in 2021, once again, Alabama looking at being a big favorite in that game. 18.5-point favorites there against the Auburn Tigers. So I guess the question is, what do you do with this then? Does that mean that the rest of the SEC West and Florida, a crossover opponent from the SEC East, does that mean those programs should wave the white flag and just give up on the season? the answer to that question is obviously no. The fact is that when Alabama has lost, given the fact that they are such a dominant team, going back to when Nick Saban first became coach there in Tuscaloosa in 2007, given the fact they've been such a dominant team, it's almost by definition that when Alabama loses, it's going to be a bit of a surprise. It was in 2014 when Ole Miss did it. It was a surprise when Ole Miss got the revenge, got the second straight win in that series in Tuscaloosa in 2015. That also probably came as a surprise. Auburn's win in 2017, few would have predicted that before the season began. Maybe even the same thing would be true for LSU's win in 2019, even though LSU as a program had kind of done everything at that point up until beating Alabama. When LSU coach Ed Orgeron went to SEC Media Days that summer prior to actually beating Alabama, when he talked about that was the next thing they wanted to do, closing the gap on Alabama, there were some media voices in the room that day that kind of laughed at Orgeron for saying that he thought his team was closing the gap on Alabama, because at that time it had been so long since they'd won that game, but they did actually go out there and show how true that was by beating the Tide on the field there in 2019. So if you're an SEC team kind of hoping for a chance at, doing what LSU did in 2019 or what Auburn did in 2017 or what Ole Miss did a couple of years back in the 2014-2015 era, the fact that the FanDuel Sportsbook right now doesn't favor you to do that probably doesn't mean very much, because Alabama starts the season with a whole lot of steam all the way around. But for people like me on shows like this, spending time the way we do, trying to figure out, well, who is the threat to Alabama? It's got to come from somewhere, something to make, the upcoming season add to the intrigue and add to the mystery. The fact of the matter is, sometimes there isn't a surprise team waiting around the corner. Sometimes there isn't a team ready to play the role of spoiler against defending national champion Alabama. And for now, that's exactly what FanDuel sort of thinks it sees. As we continue to be above the fold here on SEC Country Live, let me also kind of go back and look at some of these other point spreads now beyond just Alabama, the rest of the SEC here for a moment, because there's also some other point spreads shared here that I think are kind of interesting and certainly conversation starters for us, beyond just the fact that Alabama is a double-digit favorite at least in all of its big games for the upcoming year. You may have seen a moment ago Georgia as a 3-point underdog right now to Clemson. This is a Georgia team that seems to have its quarterback figured out in JT Daniels, seems to have a lot going for it. Georgia, likewise, will be a big favorite in most of the games that it's played this year, but not against the perennial playoff team, Clemson there. Clemson, even with Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne moving on from the program, the fact of the matter is, at least according to FanDuel, the more established brand there, Clemson, gets the 3-point nod, neutral field. Remember that game in Charlotte to begin the upcoming season. By the way, we'll have more on that game later on with Chip Patterson from CBS Sports. I think another interconference matchup here early in the year that's very interesting is Texas going to Arkansas. A lot of folks watch us from Arkansas. You know how much your program hates Texas going back to the Southwest Conference days. So there's a real juicy element to this Texas-Arkansas game. And for Texas trying to break in first-year coach and Steve Sarkisian, Sam Pittman year two, one of the surprising teams in the SEC West last year, I think this is actually a really fun upset opportunity for Arkansas out of the SEC against one of the powers of college football, Texas, or at least one of the perceived powers in Texas. I think that's a pretty fun game. Looking at the rest of these games around the rest of the SEC, you see the Deep South's oldest rivalry, which will be played in the month of October this year. Last year kind of started all this after these two teams had played in November for a long time. Last year in the COVID year, everything was weird. But now this game will take its sort of customary home in the month of October after having been in November for as long as any of us can remember. Georgia on the road at Auburn will play, at least right now, as a 10.5-point favorite in that spot. Don't forget, Auburn plays a tough schedule before it gets to Georgia. You've got the road game at Penn State for Auburn. You've got the game against LSU. So this is an Auburn team that will either be flying high on the basis of some big wins or reeling a little bit from a tough early schedule once you get right there. One of the more interesting point spreads that's also displayed here, how about Florida as a 1-point favorite at LSU? This is one for me that's a little bit hard to explain. I have a hard time favoring Florida on the road at a place like LSU. And yes, LSU was a disappointing team a year ago, but also won the game in Gainesville. I think LSU brings back more talent for the upcoming season. I think the wrong team is favored there in that spot. Let's throw that other graphic back up one more time, if you don't mind. We'll take a look at a couple of more of these. By the way, you also saw Georgia as an 8-point favorite against Florida, not expecting the cocktail party to be very close right now. So pretty interesting stuff all the way there on that. And you see Florida, in-state rival game against Florida State, looking to be a 17-point favorite right there. I think Florida State's also, as the Mike Norvell era continues to take shape, that's a little bit of an interesting team here for this upcoming season. I think the Seminoles are worth paying a little bit of attention to there, but you see Florida as a pretty big favorite. So that's the early kind of look at this from the gambling world. This is the time of year when this stuff kind of starts coming out. You see Alabama double-digit favorite in every game that matters. Also some other interesting point spreads there too. We're going to get Chip Towers, not Chip Towers. He's our colleague from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. We're going to get Chip Patterson from CBS Sports coming up here in just a couple of minutes. Before that, though, let me also take a couple of your comments here for those who are weighing in on both Facebook and YouTube. We'll give you a chance to kind of say hello to us today and give your thoughts on everything that's going on here with around the SEC, with early point spreads starting to come out and be available, early outlook on what's happening a lot of the SEC right now. You can weigh in on a lot of that. And, of course, we're really glad to have you as we get ready to do all of that on the program here today. I hope you're having a good time. In fact, let me see if I can pull up some of these right now. Over on the YouTube side of things, G. Grace Bama Boy checking in on this. Mike D. checking in on YouTube to say that sports bettors know Georgia will win this game. Talking about the Clemson game, I believe. They just put the favorite on Clemson to drive that line over to get more money. The money, he says, will be on UGA coming the week of the game. So some confidence there for Mike D. about Georgia even as a 3-point underdog there against Clemson. Kind of interesting to hear that. Also, G. Grace Bama Boy weighing in to say that Florida will not beat LSU. And I'm kind of with G. Grace on this. To me, it's just a little bit surprising that, given the fact that, very frequently, LSU is kind of one of these, these kind of teams that Vegas and the sports books typically kind of love. They're frequently rated as kind of a, power-rated top 10 team in Las Vegas, despite the fact they've, lost some games and, sometimes they don't have the prettiest record, but typically the talent makes LSU the darling of the betting world from time to time. I'm actually a little bit surprised that you see Florida, at least from FanDuel, getting the early nod there, but that seems to be the case. We'll talk to Chip Patterson about this coming up in just a second there as well. Let me take a couple of Facebook comments before we do that. Moose Thames checking in on the program today. Moose, good to see you here. Jack Pounders checking in today. Good to see you there as well. Mike Hardy also weighing in on the Gus Malzahn buyout there at Auburn. Maybe that helps out Brian Harsin as he gets ready to start his career there, knowing that Auburn spent big on some coaches here recently they've had to get rid of. Maybe that does give just a little bit of cover to Brian Harsin here as he begins his career there. Blake Robinson also weighing in, saying it may take years and they can recruit better than you think. Either way, they are my team, and I hope I haven't and I have hope that I haven't had in a few years. So he's actually looking forward to the Brian Harsin era getting going there at the Auburn situation. So kind of interesting to hear Blake weigh in on that. Yeah, we're going to find out a lot about Brian Harsin very early in the run there for Auburn, as I said before, because you do see Auburn right now double-digit home underdog against Georgia, road trip to Penn State, the game against LSU in Baton Rouge. That's a spot Auburn hasn't won since 1999. So a lot to learn about Auburn very early in the upcoming season. Cody Taylor says, how is Oklahoma-Nebraska a game of the year candidate with Nebraska being a 20-point underdog? That's probably a pretty fair question to ask. I guess sometimes it's game of the year from the standpoint that it's going to draw a lot of gambling interest, not necessarily a game of the year in terms of the overall outcome there. But we'll continue to take some of your comments on both Facebook and YouTube about some of those early point spreads that are out there and kind of everything going on as we kind of continue to make that move towards the start of the upcoming season. For now, as promised, for a lot more on all of that, let's get ready to say hello to Chip Patterson, doing a great job covering college football, the SEC, all the other leagues included for CBSSports.com. Tremendous voice and analyst around this game, and he joins us here on SEC Country Live right now. Chip, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being with us this afternoon. I hope the off-season and the spring and summer is continuing to treat you well.
Yeah, I guess May and June is our only time to get it, right?
Yeah.
Because the college football machine starts July 1, right? Like all the coaches come back from
That's
vacation.
Right.
We got the media days kicking everything off, and it seems like it's always like right after July 4th. So that's when we start to get into big time. So, whatever you got on that, whatever you got on that calendar, anywhere you want to go, any time you want to take, you got to get it in May and June because it's the only time of the year that college football kind of catches its breath.
That is so true. And we were talking before you joined us. I love the time of year when you start seeing some of these early point spreads coming out, the look-ahead lines, games of the year, whatever you want to call them. FanDuel's had a couple of these over the course of the last few days. It's just good fodder for conversation. And when I have someone like you on the show, I kind of find myself always asking, hey, look at the SEC West, look at the reigning champion Alabama. Do you see someone in that division that can threaten Alabama? Well, to be honest here, according to at least FanDuel, maybe not, right? Double-digit favorite in all of the big games. Florida, the crossover game. A&M, there's been some chatter from Jimbo Fisher, but at least in terms of this one betting market, they don't see that game being very close. Alabama about a 2-touchdown favorite on the road. Big favorite against LSU, big favorite in the Iron Bowl against Auburn. So a little bit of fodder for the Alabama fans to say, no, the SEC West is not going to be close this year, even with Alabama replacing a lot, still the prohibitive favorite. How do you handicap that division right now?
I think that the power rating on Texas A&M probably doesn't match my opinion. And that's probably because, I think I've not checked recently, but there was a stretch where Jimbo against the spread wasn't very good. And so I could see how, maybe they don't have the quite read on him, because I play it in my head and I think there's a path for Texas A&M beating Alabama, and so I will therefore entertain it. But I understand that more times than not, Alabama probably wins that game. And I think back to how many times in that series we've seen stretches of football, and it feels like it's almost gone. And by the mid-third quarter, so Alabama hits the gas and gets to a level that Texas A&M cannot. But I do think that there have been stretches of football since Jimbo Fisher arrived in those specific matchups where they're going blow for blow and they're starting to land a couple punches. I think to 2018 in Tuscaloosa, it was never in doubt that Alabama was going to win that game. And, of course, that 2018 Alabama team was fantastic until they weren't at the very, very end of the season against Clemson. But Texas A&M got out there. They were frisky, had a couple first-half touchdowns, had a couple big plays. So it's just stretching that out over 60 minutes. So there's a path that I could see Texas A&M winning that game in this past season, and what they've got coming back defensively especially is what I'm excited about. I think that Jimbo Fisher, with a really good defense, is going to frustrate those who are seeing college football move more to the perimeter, move more to explosive plays. But, there's a path for him to take a team that runs the ball really well behind a good offensive line and a rock-solid defense. He's just got to win that one game, because Alabama's the one team he can't beat playing that way. He's been able to show that he can do it against pretty much anybody else. That's probably where I see it a little bit differently than Las Vegas. Sounds like I'm giving the Aggies a little bit more credit.
Yeah, I would love to have the conversation where A&M does make the SEC West more competitive, simply because that'd be more entertaining for a lot of us who are not either A&M or Alabama fans. I guess my one big holdout issue, the one thing that would keep me from kind of moving my chips to the center of the table on Texas A&M, is I don't really quite know where that dynamic playmaker is coming from right now. I think that was one of the things that frankly caused people to ignore them a little bit last year, even as they were racking up those wins week after week. You don't really see that, Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase level playmaker out there. Jimbo runs a little bit different kind of offense, I would say, but just beyond that, the way in which all the best teams seem to have the really thrilling player, especially on the outside right now, I think we're still waiting to find out who that guy is in College Station, right? If he even exists.
Well, it's Isaiah Spillers. You're probably your best skill player, but he's your running back, and that's not attacking the perimeter, kind of like we were talking about earlier. But I'll say this. Do you think that Brian Harsin and Auburn are just going to be kind of a downhill run team? Are they just going to lean on Tank Bigsby?
I do.
Gus Malzahn has shown, like in the Kerryon Johnson year, for example, if you've just got a back that you can ride, then you might be able to piece it together. And I wonder if Brian Harsin, who knows about the schemes or the X's and O's. Every coach is different. Every year is different. But I could see Tank Bigsby, Isaiah Spiller. It could be interesting to see a little bit of the yin and the yang, the pendulum swing, a couple of SEC West teams. While you got Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, obviously, and Mike Leach at Mississippi State, so I don't know where that offense went last season.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting if we had both Texas A&M and Auburn saying, well, you know what, y'all can do that. We're just going to do it this way. And that could turn into some winning football. Again, I'm not going to bet it to beat Alabama.
No,
Alabama's still my pick. but I think it's an interesting wrinkle.
I do too, because it kind of brings up something that other people have kind of said on this show in the past, which is, you've seen this explosion of offense year after year after year where, like LSU and 2019 averaged 45 points a game. I think Alabama last year was closer to 48, 49 points a game, where it seems like every year the offense, like the threshold of human achievement, just seems to, keep being surpassed. At a certain point in time, is there kind of a move back the other direction where, because Auburn doesn't have very many wide receivers, they're content to let Bigsby keep it on the ground and try to control clock? You mentioned Spiller at Texas A&M, where, all of a sudden you can't just keep exceeding the offensive firepower year after year after year the way this league seemingly has, and maybe some teams are content to run it a little bit more than we've kind of come to expect in recent years as the typical blueprint around the rest of the SEC.
I mean, and I'd love that, because that's one of the cool selling points of college football as a product that I would offer, is that it's unique, and you've got all kinds of different styles, and they clash. And when they clash, it's wild. We can't really predict it. Like the 10,000 times simulator that we've got at Sportsline, like that does not account for some of the unique things that happen when two college football teams in differing styles clash, because it can go a lot of different ways. And I think that is one of the things I like about the sport.
Couple more things while I have you, and of course it's great to have Chip Patterson from CBS Sports here with us on SEC Country Live here today. Georgia Clemson to open the season. These are two teams that expect to be rated, top 4, top, 5, or, in that area. A pretty big, well-hyped game for season openers. What does this kind of rank for you in recent season openers that you can kind of go back and, consider in your mind? And just how historic is it to have these two big behemoths playing the first game of the season in your mind?
The thing that comes to mind is Alabama, Florida State 1 versus 3 going into it in the preseason. And it's so funny because it ruined Florida State. Like, I think that game, obviously you lose your starting quarterback to injury in that game. Everything changed for the Seminoles. But, we had just watched Clemson take the throne from Florida State in 2015. Fall short against Alabama, but with that ridiculous Deshaun performance in that game. And we came into the next season thinking, all right, that was cool, Clemson, that was cute, but Florida State, it's time to take the title back. And they're going to make a run at Alabama, and they're going to get a crack at them. And will we see it again in the college football playoff? And then that is the end of Florida State's run, is that game right there. So I'm not hoping that the loser of Georgia Clemson ends up having their entire run broken, but it can be dramatic when some of these top programs clash. I can't wait, and I tell you this, there's an interesting proposal on the table. I was not the one who started it, but I do think that it is something to consider, is you take the loser of Clemson, Georgia, and you pick them to win the national championship. And you do it for two reasons. Number one, it's going to be the best price that you're ever possibly going to get on whoever loses. And number two, there is a motivational edge that you're going to get where Clemson, for example, is going to be huge favorites in every game they play. Georgia, in most games they play, not all. And all of a sudden, the sense of urgency is just ratcheted up. Now, you could exhaust yourself, and it could end up backfiring, but there's something to be said about the way that it sharpens your focus. And then doubly on top of that, just the level of focus that both these teams are going to have going into the season. I think it's going to make everybody better. I think it's going to make the backups better. I think it's going to make them both just have a little bit of that psychological edge. When you're spending all fall camp, you're not warming up for, Eastern or Western, whoever. You're warming up for a top 5 team, and you don't want to get embarrassed. You don't want to get punked on that stage. And so I think that both those teams are going to benefit from that. So maybe you wait until the national championship odds reset after week 1. Whoever the loser is, you just take them, because it might not be a bad bet, and it'll be the best price you can get.
I think that's a really fascinating angle on that. That's fun stuff. Let me squeeze in one tiny thing before we let you go. We were talking point spreads earlier with Florida, according to FanDuel, favored by a point in Baton Rouge right now. I cannot favor Florida at LSU at this point in time. I think LSU is one of the big bounce-back teams in this league. I think it's tough for Florida to replicate what they did a year ago, and by the way, even that was a 4-loss season. I am much higher on LSU right now than I am Florida.
I'm not overly confident in either right now, so I could see that being I could see that going both ways because I do have an assumption for the floor of Dan Mullen, and I'm trying to adjust it relative to expectation because even at Mississippi State the floor was still pretty high, and so I'm thinking like, okay, what was a high floor at Mississippi State? What has been a high floor at Florida, which is obviously going to be a little bit of a level up of success. And I still think that is going to always give Florida a fighting chance. It speaks to we've got our coach rankings right now up on CBSSports.com. Like it speaks to my respect for Dan Mullen there. Just to think that there's not going to be many years where LSU is going to be able to totally overwhelm you with talent because I believe LSU to be the more talented team, the more talented roster without a doubt. We got quarterbacks, we still got to figure out the quarterback position. We still got to really see that offense take off, knowing that, Keishawn Butte is awesome and they can, if everything gels together with an offensive line group that they like, the running back group should be ready to go. But those are still uncertainties for me. So it's like LSU has uncertainties, Florida has uncertainties. I'm not really ready to trust either team right now, where I think that we are going to see a bounce back for LSU. They're not going to be 500 again, but where to put the ceiling on that, I think I got to see some more. I got to hear some more before I start to feel more comfortable doing that.
You mentioned coaching rankings there at CBSSports.com. What I love is you guys stay very busy during the off season. Really good fodder for conversation. Of course, it's podcasts, everything else there as well. So, Chip, as we say goodbye to you, please remind folks how they can get a lot more of you online.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just make it simple. The Cover 3 podcast, if you're not already a listener, go ahead and give us a subscribe. Once you're listening to it, leave us a 5-star review. You can ask a mailbag question that way. We're having fun at this time of year listening to the listeners and being able to have it be a little bit of a conversation. So always reach out.
Yeah, you guys do a great job. Chip, thank you for your time. We'll look forward to hopefully getting a chance to speak to you soon.
All right, sounds good. Y'all be well.
Good stuff there. Chip Patterson, CBSSports.com, doing a great, great job and some really provocative opinions on a lot of the stuff happening around the SEC right now. Speaking of provocative opinions, we'll get a few more of yours before we dive into the rest of the SEC news here today. Tennille Calvino enjoying Chip Patterson there. That's great to see. Jerry Popham also checking in there as well. We've also got a Woe Pig Suey in the comments section from Janice Lawrence. Janice, back me up on this. I said a moment ago that I think that Arkansas has a chance to beat Texas here in the 2021 season. Up there in the northwest part of that beautiful state of Arkansas. Tell me if you think that's true there as well. Hopefully you do. Mike Hardy also weighing in on Bama being a big favorite in all of these games here this year. For sure, that is the case. Mike Hardy says that it's going to take multiple injuries for Alabama to falter in the SEC West. I guess the one thing to remember about that, though, Mike, is that Alabama has only won the SEC West twice in the last 4 years. If you look at all of the things that Alabama can accomplish in a given season, winning the SEC West for them has been about as hard as anything, right? I mean, there have been how many playoffs since 2014? I'm not great at math. There have been 6 playoffs. They've been in 5 of the 6 playoffs. They have, won, seemingly like half the national championships. But when it comes to the SEC West, they've only won twice in the last 4 years. So they have been held out of the SEC Conference Championship game a couple times here. So it can be easy to forget that when they're on top of the world because they've obviously had so much success. But the SEC West is a difficult grind even for a program like Alabama. Even for a program that has an overwhelming talent advantage over most of the teams that it plays, the fact is there are still tough Saturdays for Bama in the SEC West. I think the issue, though, is trying to figure out, which team is it going to be, because it's not the same thing every time, right? It was Hugh Freeze at one point in time and has been Gus Malzahn, but Malzahn's out of this league now. It has been Ed Orgeron before, and Orgeron tried to speak with a lot of bass in his voice at the end of that 2019 season or that 2019 game against Alabama about keeping the fight going, but clearly they were not able to come back and do that again the following year. So I think the issue is, which team will it be, if it will be anyone? But in terms of being someone, history would suggest that it probably will. Henry Blizzard says Alabama's ruined football. No one's going to beat them. That idea of ruining football, as Henry brings up there, I'm a wrestling fan, big pro wrestling fan, and there used to be this concept in pro wrestling called like a division killer. like Andre the Giant. Now, I'm too young to really remember when Andre the Giant was like at his best and his healthiest. But when the Giant was at his best, Andre was not the champion. And the thought was you couldn't put the belt on Andre because he was a division killer. That once he had the title, there was no way to get it off of him because there was no conceivable way that he could lose. So Andre the Giant spent his entire career essentially winning battle royals and, fighting other big guys and, things like that. But, not in the title picture whatsoever because he was kind of a division killer. I guess maybe you kind of think of Alabama kind of the same way. But let's not forget, we've seen SEC teams step in there and do that every now and then. So we shall see. We shall see. A couple of more on here. Let me pop over to YouTube for a second. We got a Go Gators coming in here from Chet. Is it Ringeson? Chet, did I pronounce your name correctly? Is it Ringeson? Ray Miller says Bama builds champions. Yeah, listen, you got to give them a lot of credit. They've done that. Whitney Blaylock also asking about Florida, whether or not the Gators have a chance. I think it's going to be a very tough year for Florida. I think a lot of this, Whitney, kind of comes down to what happens with Emory Jones at that quarterback position. And does he take the mantle, take the reins? In some ways, he looks like the kind of quarterbacks, a guy who has some ability with his legs. He looks like some of the kinds of quarterbacks that have had great success under Dan Mullen. But when you listen to Mullen at the end of spring practice, it did not seem like Mullen was speaking with full confidence in how he was talking about Emory Jones. So a lot about what's going to happen for Florida, I think, is about what happens to that quarterback position and how well Emory Jones does in terms of leading all of that. Kevin Cook says, those lousy, stinking lake lizards will finish third in the SEC. So Kevin, a Georgia fan, not a big believer in Florida for the upcoming year. William Perry checking in. This is actually a good question. William asked on YouTube, who finishes last in the SEC West? Boy, that's really interesting. Who is your pick to finish last in the SEC West? I think I still might say Mississippi State. I know there's supposed to be this year two bounce for Mike Leach. That has typically happened for him. But, boy, that's a good question, William. Y'all weigh in on this in the comment section. Who do you, whether it's YouTube or Facebook, either one, who do you think finishes last in the SEC West? That's a great question. Mike D also says it's hard to call what's going to happen in the West this year. It seems like A&M should be somewhat at the top with Bama, LSU, Arkansas, Miss State, Ole Miss, the toss-up. Auburn is rebuilding. Yeah, I can't ask too much from Auburn. If I could sell stock, like short a stock, as sometimes you do, my short stock would probably be on Ole Miss. I just don't believe in Lane Kiffin to the same level others do. I realize that he's got a quarterback in Matt Corral that he might be able to do something with. I just don't know. G. Grace, a Bama fan, actually talking up Auburn a little bit. He says, I see them winning 8 games. I think if you win 8 games against that schedule, G, then you got to talk about Brian Harsin in that Coach of the Year category. And he's a little bit of a proven winner. He's won a lot of games at Boise State. But, man, 8 games given the schedule that includes Penn State out of conference, Georgia from the SEC East, and, of course, the entirety of the SEC West. At a certain point in time, you're talking about a big, big challenge facing Auburn all the way around. So very interesting comments. They will continue to come in our comment section here on SEC Country Live throughout the rest of the show. Let me kind of continue the news, though. This is the portion of the show we call it our all points bulletin. We're going to check in around the rest of the SEC with some of the big news that's out there. We had a couple of commenters mentioning Florida a moment ago, so let's go to Gainesville, Florida here for a moment. Florida giving some good news to its fans. Maybe not unexpected news, just given the trends that have been out there as of late, but to me, still worth celebrating nonetheless. Florida putting out there on Twitter this week that they are ready to welcome back full attendance to the Swamp for the upcoming season. You see it right there from the official account, 90K strong back in the Swamp, beginning to sell those tickets. This is something you may remember that Florida coach Dan Mullen wanted to do last year, was kind of received somewhat controversially when he kind of said that off the cuff, kind of shooting from the hip after what he thought was an impactful crowd in the loss at Texas A&M a year ago. Did not get his wish with full crowds last year, but will get his wish for that this year. We have not seen a lot of other SEC teams make that kind of official announcement yet, but you see lots of circumstantial evidence that would lead you to believe we are heading in that direction. More SEC teams are now welcoming in full crowds for baseball. Georgia's doing that this week against Ole Miss. I think I saw where Founders Park there in Columbia, South Carolina is now welcoming full attendance. Vanderbilt recently made that announcement not too long ago. Tennessee just had, we talked about an amazing baseball crowd last weekend in Knoxville, what Tennessee had on hand for its series against number 1 Arkansas. So you see these full crowds for baseball, and you see a lot of these football teams moving that direction. Florida goes ahead and makes the official announcement here, and I think it's great to see. I think that we all know what the last year and a half has been like, and so many of us have kind of endured that in our own way. And I think a lot of us are looking for those reasons to feel good about what's next, to celebrate the next thing, and college football getting back to normal, especially in the fall, with a lot of these spring and summer sports acting as a little bit of a transition for all of that, getting back to normal for the upcoming year. So many of us are so eager for that, not just for the fans inside the stadium, but the tailgating going on around the games there as well. You get the sense that's exactly what we're heading for, and I think that's a great thing to see. And don't discount, when you look across the world of sports, college football in particular, college football was not immune to the smaller TV ratings, the way that a lot of sports dealt with that last year. I would say the absence of fans hurt the product on TV, maybe more than some of us assumed that it probably would. The games just didn't feel quite as real when you didn't have, the fans and the authentic cheers rising up when something happened. All of a sudden, the games themselves didn't maybe feel quite as much fun to watch. I think that's all kind of tied into this here, that football is getting back to normal for those who are lucky enough to go to the games, but for those who just like watching them on television, the game that you watch on TV is going to feel a little bit more real and a little bit more like what you're used to there as well. It's good news all the way around. So good job by Florida for helping usher all that in, and we'll watch as other SEC teams over the course of the next couple of weeks get ready to make their own announcements there in that regard. Continuing our All Points Bulletin, looking at the rest of what's going on around the SEC, we'll go to Athens, Georgia here for a moment, or actually we'll talk about the way in which some in Athens, Georgia are on their way out west. I'll give you one example of this from Georgia wide receiver Jermaine Burton on Twitter, who did spend some time in his high school career in Calabasas, California, but one of a few Georgia players who have now made the move, at least for a few days here, a couple of weeks, from Georgia out to California. Burton putting this out on Instagram in his Instagram story of kind of showing up there in the California area. We'll take a look at that on the screen there from Laguna Beach. They're obviously having a good time. So Burton's one of the Georgia receivers. He's there. You've got Demetrius Robertson, who's out there. You've got JT Daniels, who obviously hails from the state of California, Kendall Milton much the same way. It's going to all be told, 10, 12, I'm not even sure what the full number is, but a lot of Georgia guys kind of traveling out there to be around JT Daniels in his home state of California. Other Georgia players who have California or West Coast ties, they're all going to be there, and this is a chance for them to kind of get on the same page from a chemistry standpoint together. Obviously, quarterbacks throwing the football, receivers catching the football. A lot of that is about timing and chemistry, but there's actually even more to the story than just that. It's not just true for Georgia. It may be true for many of the other SEC schools there as well. I thought Mike Griffith, who covers the Georgia Bulldogs for my other website, DogNation.com, had something interesting to say about that when he joined me on my other show, Dog Nation Daily, here this morning. Georgia players heading to California. This is why, at least from the perspective of UGA, that might be important.
It used to be that was the norm, but now everybody's, got their own handheld entertainment system, their own social media network, and teams aren't as close as they once were, right? I mean, it's a different world. I mean, it's a different society. Being close to somebody now, putting on a headset and playing a video game with them 2,500 miles away. It's just that's how things are, and frankly, because of their schedules, there's not a whole lot of time for that sort of thing when you look at what a student-athlete has to do now.
I think there's actually a pretty good point in there, and I think this goes beyond just Georgia, although in this case it matters for Georgia. I think we've seen a very weird last 12 months around college football, and I think the challenge and the stress associated with putting games on the field during a global pandemic, I think it was substantial. And I think in the aftermath of all of that, I think in some form or fashion, rebuilding team chemistry, making teams feel close again, I think it's going to be an important job, which is not to say that Georgia maybe doesn't feel close right now, but I think all programs can work hard to reconnect with each other. After last year, the goal was you got to stay 6 feet apart. And my guess is, while I was not behind closed doors with a lot of these programs, my guess is there were a lot of extra steps taken to make sure certain players didn't get too close to other players, because that's one more person that's contaminated in the event that somebody comes down with the coronavirus, tests positive for that. You got to try to keep people apart from each other. That means while you're practicing, but also while you're kind of away. It was a hard year. A lot of us kind of lived through that same stuff in our own way there as well. Well, now it's time to kind of bring people back closer again. Players getting vaccinated. Everybody's healthy, moving towards that direction anyway. And so reconnecting with some form of team chemistry this offseason, I think is not just important for Georgia and some of the players trying to do that out in California right now, as Mike Griffith told us on Dog Nation Daily this morning, my other show, but also for a lot of the rest of the SEC teams there too. This is an important time where a lot of the work that goes on, we may be aware of some of these Georgia players going to California, but for a lot of the work around a lot of these SEC teams, this is stuff that we don't necessarily see. It doesn't all get videoed and put up on social media. Some of it's quiet and behind closed doors, and frankly, probably the best stuff is the stuff that we don't get to see. But it's not just about sharpening your skills as a football player. It's also about deepening the connection when you have with the other football players on your team. That's going to be an important part of this here during this offseason. By the way, speaking of the University of Georgia, a former Georgia defensive back, Major Burns, has announced his intentions. He went into the transfer portal. We talked about this, I think it was on last week's show. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago by now. But we have talked about Major Burns leaving Georgia to the transfer portal. Of course, Burns hails from the state of Louisiana, so probably no surprise that he has now announced his intentions to return to Louisiana. And you see, I actually think this is a pretty cool edit by LSU. The Welcome to Baton Rouge, Louisiana road sign there. The some of the, I guess, the landmarks from Baton Rouge in the background there. Major Burns going back to LSU. This is a guy that, was going to contribute to some depth there at Georgia. Will now move on to LSU to try to do that there. Of course, Georgia's already acted quickly to kind of bring in another SEC-level transfer to its program in Brandon Turnage, who leaves Alabama, comes to Georgia. So a little bit of a similar musical chairs here of a talented guy who's been in the mix for multiple SEC schools, moving on to Baton Rouge. Turnage, talented guy from Oxford, Mississippi. Some thought he might go to Ole Miss, went to Alabama, didn't work out for there. Now he's on his way to Georgia. You see, some of this musical chairs being played by players of almost a similar recruiting stature. And obviously, a lot of these moves, whether it be Burns going from Georgia to LSU, or Turnage going from Alabama to Georgia, or some of the other stuff that we're going to talk about, we'll actually get to another transfer piece of news here in a little bit before we're done on the program. All of this seems to be done with the anticipation that the SEC is going to join. I think it was the Pac-12 actually most recently did this, which is going to end that prohibition on immediate eligibility for intra-conference transfers. Some of this would lead you to believe that's exactly where the SEC is heading on all of this. So Burns leaving Georgia, going to LSU. It's a pretty big pickup for Ed Orgeron. Orgeron talked this week. He does a weekly radio interview in Baton Rouge, and he talked about they're welcoming in their incoming freshmen to campus right now. They're going to work hard to get these guys, up and running and ready to go. Obviously, LSU has lost a lot off its roster the last couple of years, both in terms of guys who just aged out of the program, moved on the NFL. You had some opt-outs. You've had some transfers. There's been a little bit of a revolving door in and out of the LSU program. So with guys coming in, now there's talk about, who's, kind of coming in to replace and what's going to happen there next. And obviously Burns, one of those guys on his way there to the LSU program. So LSU looking to add some depth there in the person of Major Burns on his way to that program. Let's keep our All Points Bulletin going here on SEC Country Live for a moment. And don't forget, we'll have more of your comments before we're done on today's show. But I want to show you a nice piece of video for those of you who are South Carolina fans, or just those of you who like to see guys on their way back from injury. Marshawn Lloyd, very impressive running back recruit from recruiting cycle a couple years ago, spent his first year on campus in South Carolina dealing with a pretty significant injury. But the video I'm going to show you here certainly gives you the indication that Lloyd is actually getting ready to come back from that and may be ready to help South Carolina establish a much better running game than we've seen in the past. Do we have the Lloyd video? Let's see if we can. Yeah, here's Marshawn Lloyd. Boy, you talk about cutting and looking pretty good right there in a video that was recently shared on social media. That's a pretty nice thing to see. And I think it's kind of interesting for Shane Beamer. He inherits a South Carolina program that actually ran the ball last year much better than it had before. If you want to look at one of the reasons why the Will Muschamp era kind of ended in disappointment, for a lot of those years with Muschamp, they were having a hard time kind of figuring it out offensively, and some of that was related to quarterback. But go back and look at some of the stats. South Carolina notoriously was just not a very good team when it came to running the football. Well, last year, statistically speaking, even without Lloyd, that was kind of a change in the other direction. We had Chip Patterson on from CBS Sports, a few minutes ago, one of the things that he mentioned was, hey, would it surprise you to see Auburn really lean heavily on Tank Bigsby this year? My answer to that question is no. It would not surprise me, and part of the reason I believe that is because of what you think of Mike Bobo as being at this stage of his career, a little bit more of a conservative-minded offensive coordinator than maybe he was once thought of. Well, that's what Bobo helped establish at South Carolina last year, was a Gamecocks team that was going to be a little bit more committed to the run, playing a little slower, huddling a little bit more, and that, whatever you want to call it, structure, those bones, that infrastructure is in place at South Carolina for Shane Beamer to take over here. And I think right now, one of the issues kind of plaguing Beamer a little bit is that he is a coach without an identity. Whereas, Brian Harson's identity at Boise State is, this is a guy who's won big at the group of 5 level. Now can he come do the same thing at a place like Auburn? That's a identity, right? You close your eyes, that's what you think of as Harsin. He's proved it at the Boise State level. Now will it work for him at the SEC level? The Josh Heupel hire at Tennessee, and I'm skeptical of how Heupel works out there, but there's at least an identity around Heupel as a coach. He's an offensive-minded guy. He was a very good quarterback at Oklahoma. He was really a pretty good offensive coordinator at one point in time at Missouri, and he's gone on to UCF, and he's sort of established some offensive credentials there. He is coming to Tennessee with the hopes of building a high-powered offense eventually for the Vols. Won't happen this upcoming year, but eventually that's the hope, is the quarterback-friendly Heupel can build the program in that image. Whereas for Shane Beamer, there just isn't as well established an identity. Frankly, the only thing you know about Shane Beamer is, that's Frank Beamer's son. He's famous because of his last name. And that's obviously not enough for anyone, but Beamer, because of his lack of head coaching, experience, he's not been a head coach before, hasn't even been a coordinator before. Because of that, he is sort of a coach in search of an identity right now. Well, given the way that the Gamecocks ran the football a year ago, given the fact we just showed you a video a moment ago of Marshawn Lloyd looking healthier than he's been, all of a sudden you start to think, well, maybe there's a possibility that that's an identity that South Carolina can establish. A team that's going to be more physical than a lot of the other teams they're facing, leaning on what looks to be a little bit deeper stable of running backs than you've kind of seen in Columbia in the past. So very interesting and worth watching the way in which Shane Beamer looking to lean on a healthy return for a guy like Marshawn Lloyd, a big recruiting win for South Carolina when Lloyd chose the Gamecocks. Listen, you can say what you want about Will Muschamp, and yes, I know the Muschamp era there in Columbia with South Carolina doesn't end the way that Gamecocks fans would have liked for it to. But the one thing you can't say is that Muschamp never won some recruiting battles for you. He did win some of those. Beamer actually inherits some of that talent. So in one respect, it's not a completely bare cupboard for Beamer as he takes over at South Carolina coach. He's got some talented players, at least a few on the roster. I would say one of those is Marshawn Lloyd. It's SEC Country Live. This is our APB. We're going around the SEC, looking at some of the big news around the conference. And I have to say, this is a little bit of a surprising piece of news for me. Let's go to Tuscaloosa, Alabama here for a moment. We talked, was it on last week's show we talked about this? I think we did, maybe. That TJ Finley, the LSU quarterback who had starting experience a year ago, has gone in the transfer portal. Finley going into the portal, not a surprise. That was expected. It's a very deep, at least in terms of the number of names in that LSU quarterback competition right now, that's pretty deep. Brennan, who started before, Max Johnson, who started near the end of last season, Garrett Nussmeier, pretty hot, looking prospect. For TJ Finley, he ended up feeling like he was the odd man out, lesser recruiting credentials than the other players I just mentioned, and so therefore he's on the move. So last week we talked about, well, maybe TJ Finley's going to go to Auburn. That just seems to make some sense to me, but there was a report coming out of 24/7 Sports in Tuscaloosa this week that kind of, I don't know, it surprised me just a little bit. Let me read you this from Hank South on Twitter here, talking about, and this is interesting. Hank tweets, is Alabama done dipping into the transfer portal? He says maybe not. LSU quarterback transfer TJ Finley says he has been in frequent contact with the Crimson Tide. And then he writes a story where Finley, I guess, is quoted in that story. You should check that out, 24/7 Sports. If you're a member there, you can learn a lot more about that. But doesn't it surprise you a little bit to think that Alabama might be looking the direction of TJ Finley here? I don't know if this is one of those things where Bama's a little bit concerned about its depth backing up Bryce Young. We've seen backup quarterbacks matter in Tuscaloosa before. Obviously, Tua Tagovailoa had a little bit of an injury-plagued career in Tuscaloosa over the 2018 and 19 seasons. And you, unfortunately, if you're an Alabama fan, did become fairly well acquainted with who your backup quarterback was back then. Obviously ended up being Mac Jones, who goes on to have great success once he finally had a chance to be a full season starter. But we've seen backup quarterbacks matter before at Alabama, and I'm sure that Finley doesn't foresee himself being a backup quarterback to anyone. Most quarterbacks don't. But obviously, if you kind of try to gauge Alabama's interest here, if it is real, Hank South seems to believe that it is, writing for that at 24/7 Sports, that maybe this is about, hey, what happens if Bryce Young does go down to injury? Are you really ready to trust a guy like Paul Tyson to be that guy? Is Tyson on the Alabama roster because he's a quarterback capable of leading the offense, or is this simply just a guy who's in, the bloodline of Bear Bryant, and all of a sudden that's the reason why he's in Tuscaloosa? Maybe that's kind of what's related to this TJ Finley situation, but a little bit interesting to see the way in which that name has kind of popped up there in that discussion. Now, there are other SEC schools being considered, by Finley as well. As I've said, this is a guy who started multiple games in the SEC. Most teams in the SEC, now maybe I'm a little bit surprised that it's Alabama, but most teams in the SEC would certainly not turn their nose up on a guy who's got that much experience, a guy who's been around the league just within the last year or so. So the Finley news here might be worth watching. We'll keep our eyes on that. APP rolls on here on SEC Country Live, and more quarterback news. I'm going to show you this video. This comes from Quarterback Country on Twitter, and I'm not quite so sure which fan base is going to be bothered by this more. You've got two SEC quarterbacks working out together here. You've got Bo Nix from Auburn and Harrison Bailey from Tennessee, and this sort of reminds me of the parents that tell the one high school kid, hey, we don't want you to hang around with this guy because we think he's a bad influence on you. But the other parents are saying to the other kid the exact same thing about the kid on the other side there. So if you're an Auburn fan, are you bothered that Nick's working out with Harrison Bailey? And I guess for Tennessee fans, the same thing here. Are you worried about Bailey working out with Bo Nix? I guess I'd be curious to know which fan base feels the strongest about this. However, I believe at this stage of the game, and it's not even a given that Bailey would start at Tennessee. In fact, he very well may not. They got 77 quarterbacks on that roster. I believe at this stage of the game, I'd take the future of Harrison Bailey over the future of Bo Nix. I feel like we've seen, Connor Rice producing today? I don't think he's too enthused by that comparison one way or another. But at this point in time, I think we've seen everything we need to see from Bo Nix. I just don't think it's going to happen. Famous last name, deep roots, deep connection to the Auburn program, probably the best they've got on the Plains right now, but not a guy that I necessarily expect to really take a bigger step forward from where he is right there. However, for Harrison Bailey, who played, I live in the Atlanta area. Bailey went to high school in the Atlanta area, Marietta, big power program. Ramel Keaton and Rick Gilbert and some pretty big SEC-level pass-catching targets for his high school career. This is a guy who's got some seasoning as a player. It's one of the reasons why I would have been a little bit critical of Tennessee bringing in as many transfers as they did. Hendon Hooker comes in, that's one thing. But then to go out and get Joe Milton from Michigan, I'm not quite so sure long-term the better move for Tennessee all the way around wasn't just sort of tabbing Bailey. Or if you want to do, what's his name that's suspended right now, or, somebody else, but just sort of pick one of your younger quarterbacks and build around somebody. To me, Keaton Salter, pardon me for misremembering the name there, but pick one of your young quarterbacks and just sort of build around him. And for me, if it was me in Knoxville, I believe it'd be Bailey, the guy that I'd pick around. So Tennessee fans, Auburn fans may actually join themselves in agreement here. They don't like seeing their guy work out with the other guy. But if you give me a side-by-side comparison between the two, I believe I'd go future of Harrison Bailey over the future of Bo Nix right now. That might be my opinion on that. Let's go back to Auburn here another moment as well as part of our All Points Bulletin. This is actually some breaking news. We don't always get a lot of breaking news in the show here, but we do get some breaking news related to Auburn coming out just a few minutes ago, related to a pretty big-time transfer. Donovan Kaufman, safety, leaving Vanderbilt, was going to choose today between Auburn and Texas. And Kaufman has chosen Auburn here. So Kaufman looking to be reunited. And you see a nice little graphic there on the screen with the War Eagle. And I guess all the Auburn mascots, the tiger and everything else. Maybe they all makes an appearance there in that graphic. But Kaufman on his way there to Auburn now, being reunited with his former head coach Derek Mason as defensive coordinator there with the Tigers. And this is going to be one of those big offseason stories. Mentioned before, first-year coach in the SEC. Maybe even for some of these second-year coaches there a little bit as well. Guys like Pittman, Leach, and Kiffin. But for certainly the first-year guys, Beamer, Heupel, Harsin at Auburn, there's a lot of open spots there on those rosters. And how can you manage and massage the transfer portal as a way of filling those roster spots? In the case of Kaufman, this is actually, I think, a pretty nice addition. A guy that's got some experience around the SEC. And Auburn, I would say, adds themselves a pretty good one there on that. And that is our All Points Bulletin, checking on the news around the SEC here on SEC Country Live. All right, let me do a couple more comments, and then we'll get ready to wrap up here on a Wednesday. Hope all of you are having a good time. Enrique Murillo questions the accuracy of Bo Nix, and that may be one of the issues there, that Nix just had a hard time kind of being accurate. I know one of the things he's going to have an issue with this year is Eli Stove's not in that program anymore. Anthony Schwartz not in that program anymore. Seth Williams is not in that program anymore. I'm not quite so sure which wide receivers are even left. To go back to the question that Chip Patterson asked all of us when he joined us a little earlier of, could you see Auburn heavily leaning on Tank Bigsby? One of the reasons why I believe that answer is likely yes is simply because there's just not a lot of receivers left in the Auburn program right now, at least at kind of a high level. Let's see what else is going on. G. Grace Bama Boy says Finley's got a big arm. Accuracy is the problem. Yeah, there's no question that when Finley steps in that pocket and releases that football, he looks like a big-time quarterback when he does it. It's some of the results after that you kind of left to wonder about. Let's see what else. Good to see Cliff Nelson back in the comments section here. Cliff says, and Cliff's an LSU fan, he says, be interesting to see how Bryce Young having to perform in packed SEC stadiums, unlike what Mac Jones did. I do think that's an important point. I think that, I don't know if it's Cliff or somebody else has brought this up in the past, that one of the reasons why, if you're saying all-time great teams, is it 2019 LSU or is it 2020 Alabama? The fact that LSU did have to do it in full stadiums. They won on the road in Tuscaloosa in 2019. If we're having a comparison between the all-time great SEC teams, certainly all-time high-powered offenses, between that LSU team in 2019 and Alabama in 2020, because LSU did have to do it in some hostile road environments, I'd probably take LSU in that conversation. Thomas Glass checking in over here saying, y'all going to need all you can get. Roll Tide roll, so he's having a good time. Moose Thames says Auburn's lucky to have Mike Bobo as its offensive coordinator. We'll find out if Auburn fans feel lucky about that once the season comes to an end. Tim Kynes checking in to give you a go dogs here. Like to see those comments kind of rolling in here. Folks having a good time on the Facebook side of things. Scott Coffin says the Dogs going to beat Alabama. He says Alabama's not going to win 10 games this year. He says, say 8. Wow, so Scott Coffin giving you some big, strong opinions there all the way around. Pretty interesting to see. Enrique Murillo also weighing on the YouTube side of things there, too. Mike D says, will we be at SEC Media Days? Yes, that is the plan. Assuming the SEC allows media to be there, and right now I guess the thought is they will. We are looking forward to being at SEC Media Days, including a special edition of SEC Country Live back in Hoover, Alabama, again for the first time in a long time. All of that should be really fun. And, of course, we'd like to kind of finish the show on kind of a lighter note, and we call it our SEC LOL. And I don't know about you, but I've been kind of LOLing lately at the very intense debate that's been going on about whether or not Tim Tebow has a chance of making the Jacksonville Jaguars roster. Of course, you know that the Jags are looking to bring him in on a one-year contract in the hope that he would be able to make that team. And it's been actually the subject of an intense debate. Now, listen, I'm not a Florida fan, so on the one hand, I guess, I don't mind seeing, Tebow getting kind of jabbed here. But for whatever reason, I also find myself some of the criticism of Tebow a little distasteful. So you've had this kind of back and forth thing going on. So much so that there's a YouTube video from several years ago, now like 10 years ago, that's gotten several 100,000 views just in the last few days. So this is supposedly supposed to be proof that Tim Tebow is going to be able to play tight end at the NFL level. This is him, I think this is a Vanderbilt game in the swamp. That's him running his route. That's him jumping up and making the catch. And this one home movie type thing of Tebow has now gotten several 100,000 YouTube views just in the last few days alone. So I guess you can decide for yourself if that proves anything related to Tim Tebow's skills there as a tight end. But one thing I think we can all agree on, the intense debate this creates and all the, the hot take shows and ESPN and FS1 and everything else, the intense debate that all this creates is certainly a pretty funny thing to be able to see all the way around. Hey, thank you so much for being with us here on SEC Country Live. I appreciate you being Wednesday, 3 p.m., either showing up on the SEC Country Facebook page or the SEC Country Live YouTube page, interacting with your comments, sharing the show, telling folks we're out here doing this each and every day means a ton to me. I appreciate that. We'll be back again the same time next Wednesday, 3 p.m. More guests, more talk, more opinions around the rest of the SEC. We'll look forward to doing that with you then on SEC Country Live. Talk to you next week, everybody.